The person who wins the argument isn't always the one who's right. It's the one who controls how the argument unfolds. Think about the last heated debate you witnessed. One person had facts and logic on their side, but somehow the other person, through tone, timing, or some invisible maneuver, walked away looking like the victor. That's not luck. That's mastery. Winning arguments isn't about having the truth. It's about understanding the psychological mechanisms that make people believe, doubt, or concede. It's about knowing which cognitive buttons to press and which logical traps to set, all while appearing perfectly reasonable. Today, we're diving into 50 psychology-backed techniques that will teach you how to destroy anyone in an argument. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. And be honest, have you ever been in an argument where you knew you were right, but somehow still lost? Let me know. I want to hear your stories. Let's begin. Trick 1. Cognitive load saturation. You're in an argument. Your opponent is mid-thought, processing what they want to say next. This is the moment. You introduce not 1 point, but 4, 5, 6, all at once, all seemingly connected, all demanding attention. Before we address that, consider how it relates to the economic implications we discussed, the historical precedent from 3 different eras, the neurological research published last month showing decision-making under stress, and how your initial claim actually contradicts the very framework you're now using to defend it. What just happened? Your opponent's working memory, which can only hold about 4 chunks of information at a time, just got flooded. Their executive function, the part of the brain that analyzes and reasons, starts to degrade. Not collapse, just degrade. Enough. The brain enters what we call triage mode. It can't process everything, so it starts accepting surface-level conclusions just to reduce the cognitive strain. You sound thorough. You sound like you've done the work. And they're too overwhelmed to check whether you actually have. The mistake most people make is doing this too obviously. It has to feel natural. Like you're just being comprehensive, not like you're burying them. Quick pause here before we proceed further. If this type of valuable content is your thing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Now let's proceed further. Trick 2. The primacy anchor. Whoever defines the argument first wins half the battle before a word is exchanged. This is anchoring. The first piece of information, the first number, the first frame, the first moral lens, becomes the reference point for everything that follows. If you let your opponent set the anchor, you're already working uphill. Shifting an established anchor requires 3 to 5 times more cognitive effort than setting one in the first place. So you speak first. You frame first. Let's be clear about what we're actually discussing here. This is fundamentally about respect, not about the surface issue you're presenting. Now the entire argument has to flow through your frame. They're not arguing their point anymore. They're arguing within the boundaries you've drawn. The brain is lazy. It's a pattern matcher. It would much rather adjust from an existing reference point than build an entirely new framework. You've just given it that reference point. Trick 3. Strategic ambiguity. There's a difference between being vague and being ambiguous. Vague is weak. Ambiguous is powerful. When you use precise ambiguity, you sound specific while remaining flexible. You use words that have multiple valid interpretations, and you let your opponent fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. I'm concerned about the trajectory we're on. Trajectory. What does that mean? Direction? Speed? The endpoint? Momentum? All of them. Any of them. You haven't committed to one interpretation, but you sound like you have. The brain craves coherence. It will construct meaning where meaning is loose. And often, it constructs meaning in ways that actually benefit your position. Trick 4. The Socratic trap. This is the Socratic method, but weaponized. You're not asking questions to learn. You're asking questions to guide your opponent into arguing against themselves. The sequence matters. Each answer needs to create the premise for your ultimate point, and it has to feel genuinely curious, not adversarial. So you believe intention matters more than outcome? They agree. And you agree that outcomes can be measured objectively? They agree again. Then how do you reconcile supporting policies that you admit cause measurable harm? They just built your argument for you, with their own hands, using their own logic. People resist external claims, but they accept their own logical conclusions, even when contradictory. Trick 5. Temporal displacement. Time is not neutral in an argument. Where you place the consequences, past, present, future, changes everything. In 50 years, this won't even be remembered as a controversy. Suddenly, the stakes feel smaller. The brain discounts future events hyperbolically. But flip it. Right now, in this moment, someone is suffering because of this. Now it's immediate, visceral. You're not changing the facts. You're changing the time frame. And the time frame changes how the brain processes moral judgment and risk. Trick 6. The false dichotomy offer. You present two options as if they're the only possibilities. Both lead to your conclusion. Either you accept that X is true, or you're claiming Y is false. But Y has been established for decades. There might be a middle ground. There might be nuance. But you've eliminated all of that from the conversational space. Binary thinking reduces cognitive load. It's easier to choose between two options than to generate a third one from scratch. The key is that one option has to seem reasonable. So either you're saying expertise doesn't matter, or you're agreeing we should listen to the consensus here. Most people don't want to say expertise doesn't matter. So they accept the second option, which was your position all along. Trick 7. Emotional inoculation. You know the emotional argument is coming. You can feel it building. So you deploy it first, before they can. I know this feels personal. It should. But that feeling exists whether or not the underlying claim is true. You've just acknowledged the emotion, validated it, and transcended it in a single breath. This is inoculation theory. Mild exposure creates resistance. You've given them a small dose of the emotional argument, framed sympathetically, and now they can't use it against you with full force. The mistake people make is dismissing the emotion. Don't be emotional about this. That's gasoline on fire. You must validate before redirecting. Show you understand the feeling, respect it, and then gently move past it. When you acknowledge the emotional argument preemptively, you remove the weapon. They can't deploy an emotion you've already validated and contextualized. Trick 8. The definitional slide. Words are slippery, and you can make them even more so. You start with one definition. Clear, specific, everyone agrees. Then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, you let that definition evolve as the argument progresses. Start with fair, meaning equal treatment. Everyone nods. 10 minutes later, fair means equitable outcomes. Still nodding, though some are slower. By the end, fair means morally justified. And somehow, you've maintained consistency the entire time. This is semantic drift. The brain tracks concepts more than precise definitions. Gradual shifts go unnoticed because the word stays the same even as its meaning migrates. The key is that the shift must be gradual and plausible. Abrupt changes get caught, but small movements, natural progressions, feel like clarifications rather than manipulations. Trick 9. The burden reversal. Normally, the person making the claim bears the burden of proof. But you're going to flip that. You frame your claim as the default position, as the obvious truth, as what everyone already knows. And their skepticism becomes the extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. Millions believe this. You're claiming millions are wrong. What's your evidence for that extraordinary claim? Now they're the one who has to prove something. They have to prove a negative. They have to demonstrate that millions of people are mistaken. That's a comprehensive, exhausting task. You only need examples. You only need a few data points. Proving a positive is easy. Proving a negative requires eliminating every possibility. The mistake is trying this with obviously false claims. Your assertion must be plausible enough that framing it as default seems reasonable. If it's clearly absurd, the reversal fails. Trick 10. Manufactured consensus. Humans are tribal. We feel pain, actual neural pain, when we hold minority positions. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain, lights up when we're socially excluded. So you create the perception of consensus. You reference most people, experts agree, everyone knows, but you keep the attribution vague. I mean, most people who've actually studied this understand. What have you just implied? That there's expertise involved, that there's consensus among that expertise, and that your opponent, by disagreeing, lacks that expertise. You haven't cited a single specific expert. You haven't named a study. You haven't provided a number. But the perception of widespread agreement is now hanging in the air. The bandwagon effect takes over. The brain wants to be with the group. Being outside the consensus feels threatening. So the natural impulse is to move toward what seems like the majority position. The mistake is citing consensus where your opponent knows you're lying. If they're aware the field is divided or that experts disagree, your manufactured consensus collapses. It only works when the claim is plausible enough that they can't immediately disprove it. Trick 11. The specificity shield. Numbers have power. Dates have power. Precision has power. When you include hyperspecific details, precise numbers, exact dates, technical terminology, granular specifics even for minor points, you create an aura of authority. You signal that you've done the work, that you've researched, that you know what you're talking about. In the 2019 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Cognitive Psychology, specifically the July issue, pages 347 through 349, they found a 23.7% correlation between working memory capacity and susceptibility to cognitive load manipulation. Did you catch what just happened? The specificity itself became evidence. The brain uses cognitive shortcuts. When someone speaks with that level of precision, we assume they must have actually read the study. We assume the details are accurate. We assume expertise. And so critical analysis gets bypassed. The specificity acts as a shield. It protects the claim from scrutiny because challenging it would require someone to actually go check the July 2019 issue, find pages 347 through 349, and verify that 23.7% correlation. Most people won't do that. The cognitive cost is too high. So the claim stands, protected by its own precision. The mistake people make is using specifics that can be easily fact-checked and disproven. If you're going to deploy hyperspecific details, they need to be either accurate or obscure enough that verification is impractical in the moment. Otherwise, the shield becomes a liability. But when used correctly, specificity signals research and confidence. And confidence, even false confidence, is persuasive. Trick 12. Strategic concession. Most people think winning an argument means never giving ground. They're wrong. Strategic concession is about identifying the minor, peripheral, defensible elements of your opponent's argument and agreeing with them. Enthusiastically. You're absolutely right about that detail. I hadn't considered it that way. That's a fair point. What just happened? You signaled good faith. You demonstrated that you're not blindly defending a position. You're willing to acknowledge truth wherever you find it. And that makes you seem more credible. But here's the deeper mechanism: reciprocity. Giving creates psychological debt. When you concede something to your opponent, they feel obligated, often unconsciously, to concede something in return. It's a fundamental principle of negotiation and human interaction. You gave them something. Now they owe you. So after the concession, you pivot. But that actually strengthens my point about the core issue, which is, you've built credibility. You've triggered reciprocity. And now when you defend your major point, you do so from a position of perceived fairness and reasonableness. The mistake is conceding too much or conceding on central issues. You only give ground on things that don't matter to your core argument. Peripheral details, tangential points, things that are defensible but ultimately irrelevant to the main question. Done correctly, strategic concession makes you seem honest while actually strengthening your position. Trick 13. The metaframe. There's a level above the argument itself. And whoever controls that level controls the argument. This is metacommentary. You step outside the argument and describe what's happening as if you're an objective observer. Notice what's happening here. We're both defending positions instead of examining evidence. Let's step back. You've just narrated the argument. And by narrating it, you've positioned yourself as transcending it. You're no longer just a participant. You're the person who can see the bigger picture, the person with perspective. Metacommentary creates authority, because whoever can describe the process appears to understand it better than whoever is simply caught up in it. We're talking past each other. You're focused on principles. I'm focused on outcomes. Let's acknowledge that difference. Now you're not arguing. You're analyzing the argument. An analysis feels more rational, more detached, more trustworthy than mere advocacy. The mistake is sounding condescending. This has to feel analytical, not superior. You're not saying, look at what you're doing wrong. You're saying, look at what we're both doing and how we might do it better. When deployed correctly, the metaframe gives you control of the narrative without seeming like you're trying to control the narrative. Trick 14. Semantic satiation. Words have meaning, until they don't. If you repeat a word enough times in quick succession, something strange happens. The word starts to lose its psychological weight. It begins to feel empty, meaningless. The brain experiences what's called semantic satiation, a temporary loss of meaning through repetition. Your opponent has a central concept they keep returning to: freedom, justice, fairness, whatever their anchor word is. So you repeat it again and again and again, in quick succession, until it starts to feel hollow. So freedom means this kind of freedom, not that kind of freedom, unless freedom means something else entirely. But which freedom are we actually defending? Economic freedom? Personal freedom? Political freedom? The freedom to choose, or the freedom from constraint? The word freedom has now appeared 7 times in 3 sentences. And if you're reading this carefully, you can probably feel it starting to lose its punch, starting to feel like just a sound, just syllables. This is neural adaptation. Repeated stimuli decrease response in the meaning processing regions of the brain, particularly the left temporal cortex. The word doesn't change, but our neural response to it does. The mistake is making the repetition seem mocking instead of analytical. You can't say freedom, freedom, freedom in a sarcastic tone. It has to feel like you're genuinely trying to parse the concept, genuinely trying to understand what they mean by it. But the effect is the same. Their central term loses its emotional and semantic power. And when it does, their argument loses its foundation. Trick 15. The confidence calibration. Most people speak with uniform confidence across all their claims. Everything is stated with the same level of certainty. And that's a mistake, because the brain recognizes calibrated confidence. It perceives nuance as intelligence. When you match your expressed certainty precisely to the strength of your position, you signal epistemic sophistication. You signal that you know the difference between what you're certain about and what you're merely confident about, and what you think is plausible but uncertain. I'm certain about X. The evidence there is overwhelming. I'm fairly confident about Y. The data supports it, but there's room for interpretation. And I think Z is plausible, but I'm genuinely uncertain. The evidence could go either way. This is Bayesian reasoning made conversational. You're showing your work. You're showing that you've actually thought about the strength of each claim rather than just asserting everything with equal force. And paradoxically, this makes your strong claims even stronger. Because when you finally do speak with absolute certainty, people believe you. You've demonstrated that you don't use certainty carelessly. So when you deploy it, it must be warranted. The mistake is uniform confidence. If you speak with absolute certainty about everything, you signal poor reasoning. You signal that you can't distinguish between strong and weak evidence. And that undermines even your legitimate claims. Calibrated confidence makes you trustworthy. And trustworthy people win arguments, even when they're wrong. Trick 16. The emotional label. Your opponent is getting angry. You can see it building. The volume increasing, the face flushing, the gestures becoming more aggressive. Most people either ignore this or react to it emotionally. Both are mistakes. Instead, you name it. Calmly. Observationally. I notice you're using anger here as a way to avoid the actual question. What just happened? Affect labeling. When you name an emotion, when you put it into words, you activate the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, when activated, downregulates the limbic system. It reduces the amygdala response. In simpler terms, naming the emotion reduces its power. But you have to do this carefully. You can't sound accusatory. You can't say, "You're just angry because you know I'm right." That escalates. You have to sound observational. Clinical, almost. Like you're simply noting what's happening without judgment. I notice anger entering the conversation. Let's acknowledge that, and then look at the underlying question. Now the emotion has been labeled, made conscious, made visible. And once visible, it's harder to deploy unconsciously. They become aware of their own emotional state, and that awareness itself creates distance from the emotion. This works with any emotion: guilt, fear, shame. When someone is using an emotion tactically, whether consciously or unconsciously, naming it neutralizes its power. Trick 17, the Stoic mirror. Emotional contagion is real. When someone is angry, we tend to get angry. When someone is anxious, we tend to get anxious. Emotions spread from person to person like viruses. But contagion works bidirectionally. Your opponent is escalating. Their voice is rising. They're getting emotional, heated, aggressive. And you respond with perfect calm, measured tone, even pacing, relaxed body language. I understand you feel strongly about this. Let's look at why. The contrast is devastating. Because social comparison kicks in, their emotionality, next to your calm, suddenly seems disproportionate. Like loss of control. Like they don't have a rational response, so they're resorting to emotion. You haven't said any of that. You've just been calm. But the contrast speaks for itself. The mistake is seeming robotic. You can't be completely detached and mechanical. That reads as dismissive or condescending. You have to appear humanly calm, present, engaged, but unshaken. This is the Stoic mirror. You reflect their intensity not with matching intensity, but with grounded stability. And that stability makes their instability visible. Calm, it turns out, can infect chaos just as easily as chaos can infect calm. You just have to maintain it long enough. Trick 18. Forced empathy reversal. Your opponent has been arguing against your position for 10 minutes. But have they actually understood your position? Probably not. Most people argue against what they think you said, not what you actually said. They create a strawman, a weaker version of your argument, and knock that down instead. So you stop them. Before we continue, can you explain my position back to me? I want to make sure we're understanding each other. This is forced empathy reversal. You're making them articulate your view accurately before the argument proceeds. And something interesting happens when someone has to articulate the opposing position. Perspective taking activates theory of mind networks in the brain. It temporarily reduces defensive reasoning. Because to explain someone else's position accurately, you have to, for a moment, inhabit their perspective. Most people will get it wrong the first time. They'll offer a strawman, a distorted version. That's not quite what I said. Let's try again. What is my actual claim? You insist on accuracy. You don't accept the strawman. You make them do the work of actually understanding your position. And by the time they've accurately articulated it, two things have happened. First, they've demonstrated to any observers that they weren't initially engaging with your real argument. Second, they've actually processed your real argument more deeply than they had before. This doesn't guarantee they'll agree, but it forces engagement with your actual position rather than a caricature of it. Trick 19, the vulnerability gambit. Admitting weakness seems like a bad strategy. It's not. Strategic admission of uncertainty on tangential points, not core arguments, actually increases your credibility. Honestly, I'm not sure about the exact mechanism. The research there is still unclear, but the outcome data is undeniable. What did you just do? You signaled honesty. You showed that you're not claiming to know everything. You're willing to admit the limits of your knowledge. And the brain interprets selective honesty as overall honesty. If you're willing to admit uncertainty here, you must be trustworthy when you claim certainty there. This is the vulnerability gambit. You concede uncertainty on something that doesn't matter to build credibility for defending something that does. The mistake is appearing weak on core arguments. You never say, I'm not sure if my main point is correct. You say, I'm not sure about this peripheral detail, but the central claim stands firm. Vulnerability, when strategic, makes you seem more honest. And honest people are trusted. And trusted people win arguments, even on points where they're not entirely correct. Trick 20, anger redirection. Your opponent is angry at you. The anger is personal, directed, intense. You could defend yourself. You could argue that their anger is unjustified. You could get angry back. All of those are losing moves. Instead, you redirect the anger. You channel it away from you toward an abstract third target. I get why you're angry. The whole system is designed to make people feel this way. It's frustrating. I feel it too. Notice what just happened. You validated the anger. You agreed it's justified, but you redirected it toward the system, toward a shared enemy. This is anger redirection. Anger is a force that seeks a target. It needs discharge. If you try to block it, it intensifies. If you redirect it, you preserve the relationship while satisfying the emotional imperative. We're both frustrated with how this has been handled. Let's direct that frustration toward actually solving the problem. Now you're allies against the problem, not adversaries arguing with each other. The mistake is redirecting too obviously. It can't feel like manipulation. It has to feel natural, like you genuinely understand their anger and are helping them see its real source. But when done correctly, anger redirection transforms potential conflict into potential collaboration. The emotional energy doesn't disappear. It just gets pointed in a different direction, away from you, towards something you can both oppose together. Trick 21. The guilt absolution. You're about to present information that contradicts what your opponent has been saying. Information that, if accepted, would mean they've been wrong. Maybe publicly wrong. Maybe wrong in a way that affected decisions they made. And you can feel it coming, the defensive wall they're about to build. Because nobody wants to feel guilty. Nobody wants to feel stupid. Anticipated guilt triggers defensive aggression before you've even finished speaking. So you absolve them first. Look, no one could have known this before. There's no blame here. The information simply wasn't available. But the evidence now shows. You've just removed the threat. You've signaled that you're not judging them. That being wrong before doesn't make them foolish. That changing their position now wouldn't be an admission of failure. This is guilt absolution. You preemptively remove the emotional barrier that would prevent them from hearing what comes next. When you present challenging information without this absolution, the brain interprets it as an attack. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region that processes conflict and social pain, lights up. Defensiveness becomes automatic. But when you absolve first, you're saying, "You're safe with me." And safety allows information to be processed rather than rejected. The mistake is sounding patronizing. You can't say it like you're graciously forgiving them for being an idiot. It has to be genuine. It has to communicate real understanding that anyone in their position, with the information they had, would have reached the same conclusion. Before last year, everyone in the field thought this. You weren't alone. But new research has completely changed the picture. Now they can update their belief without losing face, without feeling guilt, without experiencing that painful cognitive dissonance between their past position and present reality. Trick 22. The emotional forecast. There's something powerful about predicting an emotion before it arrives. Because once you've predicted it, once you've named it in advance, the person becomes self-conscious about displaying it. You're probably going to feel defensive when I say this, but now what happens? They feel the defensiveness rising, but you've already named it, already framed it, already made them aware of it, and that awareness changes everything. This is the emotional forecast. You predict their emotional response, and the prediction itself activates their regulatory prefrontal circuits. They become observers of their own emotion rather than just experiencers of it. The metacognitive awareness, the awareness of being aware, creates distance, space. A moment where they can choose whether to give in to the predicted emotion or demonstrate that they're more controlled than you anticipated. I know this might trigger frustration, and that's completely natural, but hear me out. You've validated the emotion before it arrives. You've made it okay to feel frustrated, but you've also made them conscious of it, which means the emotion, when it comes, will be moderated by self-awareness. The mistake is sounding manipulative. You can't say you're going to get emotional because you know I'm right. That's not forecasting. That's provocation. It has to be framed as understanding, not control. As empathy, not strategy. This is a sensitive topic, and I imagine it might bring up some strong feelings. That makes sense. Now they're prepared. They're aware. And awareness, even of intense emotion, reduces the intensity itself. Trick 23. Compassionate framing. Most arguments are structured as battles. You versus them. Your position versus their position. Winner and loser. But there's another way to structure the same conversation. We're both trying to figure this out. Let's not make each other the enemy. This is compassionate framing. You're repositioning the disagreement as a shared struggle against confusion rather than an interpersonal conflict. The language matters. We instead of you and I. Figure this out instead of determine who's right. The enemy is not each other. It's the problem itself. This isn't just rhetoric. It's biochemistry. Collaborative framing reduces testosterone and cortisol, the stress and aggression hormones. It increases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. The same neurochemical shift that happens in cooperative tasks happens here, simply through reframing. We both want to understand the truth here. We're just approaching it from different angles. Now you're allies, partners in inquiry, not adversaries in combat. The mistake is seeming fake or therapist-like. If you say this in a condescending, conflict resolution workshop tone, it backfires. It has to sound genuine, like you actually believe you're both on the same side. And here's the thing, you might actually be. Most arguments aren't really about winning. They're about being understood, about being taken seriously, about not being dismissed. When you frame the conversation compassionately, you remove the need to fight, because there's no longer an enemy to defeat. Trick 24. The dignity preservation. Your opponent is wrong. Demonstrably, clearly wrong. You have the evidence. You have the logic. You could crush them right now. Don't. Because if you humiliate them, they won't concede. They'll double down. They'll become more entrenched. Because saving face is more important to the human brain than being correct. So you construct an exit ramp. A face-saving way for them to change their position without humiliation. I mean, before that study came out last month, everyone thought what you're saying. The consensus was completely on your side. The new data just changed everything. What did you just do? You provided attribution to new information. You made it okay for them to have been wrong before because they couldn't have known. And you made it easy for them to be right now by updating to the new information. This is dignity preservation. You're removing the primary barrier to belief updating, the threat to social status. Face threat causes intractable stubbornness. When people feel their dignity is on the line, they'll defend obviously wrong positions rather than admit error. Because error, in social animals like humans, signals low status. And low status means exclusion. And exclusion, evolutionarily, meant death. So the brain fights to preserve face even at the cost of truth. But when you give them a dignified exit, you remove that barrier. The way you were thinking about this made perfect sense given the framework everyone was using at the time. We're just working with a different framework now. Now they can change their mind without losing face, without admitting they were stupid, without experiencing shame. The mistake people make is rubbing victory in their opponent's face. See? I told you. I was right all along. You win more by letting them retreat gracefully than by humiliating them in defeat. Trick 25. The emotional contrast. The brain adapts to everything. If you stay in one mode too long, all logic or all emotion, people tune out. Neural adaptation kicks in. The stimulus becomes background noise. So you alternate. Make a logical point. Data, statistics, clear reasoning. Then shift to an emotional point. A personal story, a moral question. Then back to logic. Then back to emotion. The research shows a 40% reduction in outcomes when this policy is implemented. That's not debatable, it's measured. But think about what that means for an actual person. Imagine you're the one experiencing that reduction. How would that feel? Now, looking at the broader data set, this is emotional contrast. You're creating rhythm, variability. You're preventing psychological habituation. When you hit them with pure logic for 5 minutes, they start processing it less deeply. The novelty wears off. But when you suddenly shift to emotional appeal, attention spikes again. The brain registers the change. Engagement increases. And then you shift back. Logic, emotion, logic, emotion. The mistake is staying in one mode too long. All logic makes you seem cold, disconnected from human impact. All emotion makes you seem manipulative, unserious about truth. But the rhythm, The alternation maintains attention and encoding. Different neural networks activate with each shift. Memory consolidation improves. Persuasion increases. Trick 26. The shame deflection. Someone is trying to shame you. They're not attacking your argument. They're attacking your character, your motives, your right to even hold this position. How could anyone with a conscience believe what you're saying? Most people either absorb the shame or lash out defensively. Both are losing moves. Instead, you name the tactic. That seems designed to make me feel ashamed rather than address the substance of what I'm saying. Calm. Observational. Not defensive. Just naming what's happening. This is shame deflection. Shame requires acceptance. It requires you to internalize the judgment being directed at you. But if you reject the frame, if you explicitly identify it as a tactic rather than a valid critique, the shame has nowhere to land. I notice you're trying to make this about my character instead of the argument. Let's return to the actual question. Metacognitive awareness disrupts the automatic shame response. When you name it, you activate your prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex can override the amygdala, the region where shame is processed. The mistake is getting defensive. I'm not a bad person. That accepts the frame. That signals the shame landed. Instead, you remain calm. You identify the tactic as a tactic. You redirect to substance. Character attacks are what people use when they can't address the argument. I'm happy to discuss my position. I'm not interested in discussing whether I'm a good person. Now the shame attempt is visible, exposed, neutralized. Trick 27. The third-party perspective. You're deep in the argument. Emotions are high. Positions are hardened. Both of you are too close to see clearly. So you create distance. If someone was watching this conversation, someone who didn't have a stake in either position, what would they notice? This is the third-party perspective. You're invoking a hypothetical observer to create psychological distance. And distance changes everything. When we're psychologically close to something, when we're in the middle of it, we process it emotionally. The medial prefrontal cortex, which handles self-referential processing, dominates. But when we create distance, temporal, spatial, or social, we process it more abstractly, more objectively. The lateral prefrontal cortex activates. Emotional processing decreases. Step back. Imagine you're advising someone else in this situation. What would you tell them? Now they're not defending their position. They're analyzing a situation. An analysis is cooler, more rational, less defensive than advocacy. The mistake is seeming like you're appealing to an imaginary audience for validation. Everyone watching would agree with me. That's not distance. That's just another appeal to consensus. Instead, you use the third-party perspective to help both of you see the argument more clearly. If we were reading about this conversation later, what would we wish we'd done differently right now? Distance. Clarity. A chance to escape the emotional momentum and actually think. Trick 28. Emotional momentum break. The argument is escalating. Each exchange is more heated than the last. Voices rising. Emotional intensity building. There's a momentum to it. A feedback loop where each person's emotion amplifies the others. And you break it. You stop talking. Completely. Mid-escalation. Let the silence sit. 5 seconds. 7 seconds. 10 seconds. Just silence. This is the emotional momentum break. Emotional escalation requires continuity. It requires the back and forth to keep feeding itself. But silence, unexpected, uncomfortable silence, interrupts the cycle. Here's what happens physiologically. The autonomic arousal feedback loop gets disrupted. Heart rate, which had been climbing, begins to decline after 3 to 5 seconds of silence. Cortisol levels start to drop. The sympathetic nervous system, which was in fight or flight mode, begins to calm. And then, after the silence has done its work, you resume. But calmly. Let's try this differently. The contrast is striking. You were both escalating, and now you're centered. The momentum is broken. The emotional temperature has dropped. The mistake is breaking the silence too quickly. You have to let it sit. Let it be uncomfortable. The discomfort itself is doing the work. It's creating awareness. It's forcing both of you to feel the escalation rather than just ride it. Silence is powerful. Most people are afraid of it. They rush to fill it. But in an argument that's spiraling, Silence is the emergency brake. Trick 29. The emotional reframe. Your opponent is angry, or at least that's how they're showing up. Voice raised, gestures sharp, face flushed, but you don't call it anger. I can see how passionate you are about this. That actually shows how much you care. You've just reframed their emotion. What they might have called anger, what you might have called anger, you're now calling passion. Caring. This is emotional reframing. How we label an emotion changes its physiological and experiential properties. Labels aren't just descriptions. They're interpretations. And offering an alternative interpretation provides cognitive flexibility. Fear becomes caution. Contempt becomes strong conviction. Defensiveness becomes protectiveness. The reframe has to be plausible. You can't turn rage into joy. But within a reasonable range, you can reshape how the emotion is understood. You're not attacking me. You're defending something important to you. I get that. Now the emotion is no longer a problem. It's recontextualized as something legitimate, something that makes sense. And when people feel understood in their emotions, even if those emotions are intense, they become more willing to engage rationally. The mistake is reframing inaccurately. If the reframe doesn't ring true, it will be rejected. But if it offers a plausible alternative interpretation, it can transform the emotional landscape of the entire conversation. Trick 30. The validating disagreement. This is one of the most sophisticated moves you can make. You separate validation of their feeling from agreement with their conclusion. It makes complete sense you'd feel that way given your experience. That's a legitimate response to what you've been through. And I still think we're reaching different conclusions from the evidence. What just happened? You validated them. Fully. You acknowledge that their emotional response is appropriate. That their perspective is understandable. That they're not crazy or wrong to feel what they feel. But you didn't agree with their conclusion. Most people think validation means agreement. It doesn't. Validation is about recognizing the legitimacy of someone's internal experience. Agreement is about sharing their interpretation of external reality. You can do one without the other. Your frustration is completely legitimate. I understand why you feel frustrated. And that doesn't change the logical issue we're examining here. This is therapeutic alliance applied to argumentation. Validation reduces defensiveness without requiring agreement. Because what people often want even more than being right is being understood. When you validate their emotion, you satisfy their attachment needs. You show them they've been heard. They've been seen. They matter. And once those needs are met, they become more capable of processing logical disagreement separately. The mistake is validating the conclusion instead of the emotion. You're right to think that is agreement. You're right to feel that is validation. One closes off discussion. The other opens space for it. Trick 31. The Reductio ad Absurdum. Your opponent has stated a principle, a rule, a logical claim about how the world works or should work. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable. But you're going to follow that logic to its natural conclusion. And that conclusion is going to be absurd. If intent doesn't matter, then we should prosecute surgeons who lose patients identically to murderers. What just happened? You took their principle, that intent is irrelevant to moral judgment, and applied it consistently. And when applied consistently, it leads somewhere obviously wrong. Somewhere they would never actually want to go. This is reductio ad absurdum. Reduction to absurdity. It's classical logic weaponized. If the premises lead to an absurd conclusion, then either the premises are false or the reasoning is flawed. The brain recognizes absurd conclusions viscerally. You don't need to explain why prosecuting surgeons like murderers is wrong. Everyone knows it is. And if the logic leads there, the logic must be broken. The mistake people make is choosing a consequence that isn't actually logically entailed. The absurd conclusion has to genuinely follow from their stated principle. If it doesn't, if there's a way to accept their principle without accepting your absurd conclusion, the move fails. But when done correctly, reductio ad absurdum makes the logical path visible through negation. You're not just saying they're wrong. You're showing them exactly where their reasoning breaks down by following it to a place they cannot possibly accept. Trick 32. The steel man. Most people attack the weakest version of their opponent's argument. They find the holes, the imprecisions, the places where the opponent misspoke, or didn't fully think it through. You're going to do the opposite. You're going to articulate their position better than they did. You're going to construct the strongest possible version of their argument, and then you're going to defeat it. Let me make your case better than you just did. If we're focused on outcomes only, and the outcomes here are measurably positive, then process concerns seem secondary. Why worry about how we got here if where we got is demonstrably good? That's the strongest version of what you're arguing. You've just steelmanned their position. You've shown you understand it. You've shown you're not attacking a strawman. You've demonstrated intellectual honesty. And now comes the turn. But that assumes outcomes can be measured in isolation from the processes that generated them. And decades of research shows that process violations, even when they produce short-term positive outcomes, create long-term systemic damage that ultimately outweighs those gains. You defeated the strong version, not the weak version they actually stated, the strong version you constructed for them. This move does two things. First, it signals dominance. If you can beat even the best version of their argument, you've truly won. Second, it triggers reciprocity. You were fair to them. You made their case better than they did. Now they feel obligated to be fair to you. The mistake is steelmanning a position you can't actually defeat. If you construct the strongest version and then can't answer it, you've just made their case for them more effectively than they could have. Trick 33, the conditional chain. Logic has structure, and if you build that structure carefully, step by step, you can get your opponent to accept a conclusion they would have rejected if you'd stated it directly. This is the conditional chain, a series of if-then statements where each link commits them to the next. Do you agree that expertise matters when evaluating complex claims? They agree. Of course expertise matters. And if expertise matters, then consensus among experts should carry significant weight? They agree again. That follows logically. And if expert consensus carries weight, then when 97% of climate scientists agree on anthropogenic warming, that should substantially influence our beliefs. They've already agreed to the premises, and the conclusion follows necessarily from those premises. This is modus ponens chaining. If A then B. If B then C. Therefore, if A then C. The key is getting agreement on each premise sequentially before revealing where you're going. Because if you state the conclusion first, they'll reject the premises retroactively. They'll work backwards to find reasons to disagree with the early steps. But if you build forward, step by step, commitment consistency takes over. Once they've made a public commitment to a premise, it becomes psychologically harder to retract it. They've said yes. They've agreed. And now each yes commits them to the next link in the chain. The mistake is revealing the conclusion too early. I'm going to prove climate change is real. Now they know where you're going, and they'll resist every premise that leads there. Instead, you build one step, then another, and by the time they see where you're going, they're already committed to getting there. Trick 34, the burden clarification. Arguments often fail because the standards of proof are vague. Your opponent keeps saying, that's not enough evidence, without ever specifying what would be enough. So you force clarification. Tell me your falsification criteria. What specific evidence would change your mind? What would prove you wrong? This is burden clarification. You're shifting from vague standards to concrete criteria. And here's what happens. Either they specify reasonable criteria, in which case you can provide evidence meeting those criteria, or they specify impossible criteria, in which case you've exposed that their position is unfalsifiable. You need to see 3 peer-reviewed studies showing X, conducted over at least 5 years, with sample sizes over 1,000? Okay, here they are. Now they've received exactly what they said would convince them. And if they still don't accept it, they've demonstrated bad faith. They're moving the goalposts, and everyone can see it. Or alternatively, what would convince you? What evidence could possibly exist that would change your mind? Nothing would change my mind. This is a matter of principle. So your position is unfalsifiable. You've just admitted no evidence could prove you wrong. That's not a rational position. That's faith. The mistake is accepting moving goalposts. You have to lock in the criteria first. Get them to commit publicly to what would constitute adequate proof, and then hold them to it. Public commitment to an evidence standard creates cognitive dissonance if they then reject evidence meeting that standard. They said this would convince them. It did what they said it needed to do. And now they're rejecting it anyway. That's not you losing the argument. That's them revealing they were never arguing in good faith. Trick 35. The analogical bridge. Sometimes the problem isn't the logic. It's the emotion. Your opponent is too invested in their position to see it clearly. The topic is too charged, too personal, too identity connected. So you move to a different domain. Same logical structure. Different content. Less emotional investment. You're arguing that process doesn't matter if outcomes are good. Would you apply that same principle to police interrogations? If a confession leads to solving a crime, does it matter if torture was used to obtain it? This is the analogical bridge. You're transferring the logical structure across domains. The key is that the analogy must be structurally identical. Not similar. Not kind of related. Structurally identical. The same logical relationships must hold. If they say, that's different, they need to explain what meaningful difference exists. And if there's no principled basis for treating the cases differently, you've revealed that their reasoning is arbitrary. That they're applying one standard here and a different standard there based on convenience, not logic. The mistake is using an analogy that isn't truly parallel. If there's a relevant difference between the cases, they'll point it out, and your analogy fails. But when the analogy is structurally sound, it allows the logical structure to be evaluated independently from emotional investment. They can see clearly in the neutral case what they couldn't see in the charged one. Trick 36. The hidden assumption extraction. Most arguments don't say everything they need to say. They rest on implicit premises, unstated assumptions that have to be true for the argument to work. Your job is to find those assumptions and make them explicit. Your argument only works if we assume people's stated preferences match their actual behavior. Do you believe that? What just happened? You identified the hidden premise, the assumption their argument requires but didn't state, and you forced them to either defend it or watch their argument collapse. Because here's the thing. Implicit assumptions go undefended. They slip past unnoticed. But once you make them explicit, they become vulnerable. They have to be justified. You're assuming that correlation in this case implies causation. But we both know correlation doesn't always imply causation. So why does it here? Or, you're assuming that what's natural is good. But plenty of natural things are bad. Cancer is natural. So why does naturalness equal goodness in this case? This is critical thinking applied tactically. You're not attacking what they said. You're attacking what they didn't say, but needed to be true for what they did say to work. The mistake is misidentifying the hidden assumption. If you claim they're assuming something they're not actually assuming, they'll correct you, and you'll look like you didn't understand their argument. But when you correctly identify the implicit premise, you've found the weak point, the undefended vulnerability. And now they have to defend it or concede the argument fails. Trick 37. The precedent trap. Your opponent has stated a principle. They're applying it to the current case, and they think it supports their position. But principles don't get to be selective. If it's a principle, if it's a rule about how reasoning works, it has to apply universally. So you find another case. A case where the same reasoning leads to a conclusion they would never accept. That same logic was used to justify segregation. The argument was that separate but equal preserved social harmony and respected cultural differences. Either that was correct reasoning, or your reasoning here is flawed. This is the precedent trap. You're showing that their position, applied consistently, endorses something they oppose. The cognitive dissonance is immediate. They want to maintain their principle because it supports their position in this case. But they cannot accept its implications in that case. So something has to give. Either they have to accept the precedent they find abhorrent, or they have to abandon the principle. And most people will abandon the principle. The mistake is choosing a precedent that's genuinely different in relevant ways. If there's a principled distinction between the cases, if there's a meaningful difference that justifies treating them differently, the trap fails. But when the precedent truly is parallel, when the same logic genuinely applies, the trap is devastating. Because it reveals that the reasoning, followed consistently, goes places they cannot follow. Trick 38. The empirical specification. Vague claims are unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable claims are in an important sense, meaningless. They can't be tested. They can't be proven wrong. They're not actually saying anything concrete about reality. So you force specification. You say the policy doesn't work. Define work with measurable criteria. What exactly should we observe if you're correct? This is empirical specification. You're taking a vague claim and demanding it be made testable. What outcome, specifically, would prove you right? What data would we need to see? What measurements? Over what time frame? Now they have to commit to something concrete. And concrete claims can be checked against reality. Either they specify criteria and we can test them, or they refuse to specify, in which case their claim isn't really a claim about the world. It's just an unfalsifiable assertion. We should see unemployment rise by what percentage? Over how many months? In which sectors? Give me numbers. Most weak arguments hide in vagueness. They use words like better, worse, works, fails without defining what those terms mean operationally. Specificity enables disproof. And the willingness to be specific, the willingness to state clearly what would constitute evidence against your position, is a mark of intellectual honesty. The mistake is letting them maintain strategic vagueness. You have to insist on precision, on testable predictions, on falsifiable claims. Because if they won't or can't make their claim specific, they're not actually saying anything meaningful. Trick 39, the distinction collapse. Your opponent is treating two things as different. They're drawing a distinction, and they think that distinction matters. But does it? You're treating these two cases as morally different. But they have identical outcomes, identical intentions, and identical consequences. What makes them different beyond the labels you're using? This is distinction collapse. You're showing that the alleged difference between two things has no principled basis. If the distinction has no functional consequence, if nothing actually changes based on which category something falls into, then it's not a real distinction. It's arbitrary. You call this one intervention and that one interference. But by what meaningful criterion? What's the actual difference in terms of effects, methods, or justification? The brain recognizes when a distinction is doing no work, when it's not carving reality at its joints, but just imposing arbitrary categories onto things that are fundamentally the same. The mistake is attacking distinctions that do have principled basis. Some differences are real and meaningful. You need to be sure the distinction you're collapsing is actually arbitrary before you attack it. But when a distinction is genuinely unprincipled, when it's just labels obscuring underlying similarity, collapsing it reveals the arbitrariness of the reasoning. These are functionally identical. You're treating them differently only because of how you've labeled them, not because of any actual difference in what they are or what they do. Trick 40, the internal contradiction. Logic has rules, and one of the most fundamental is the law of non-contradiction. You cannot hold that something is both true and false at the same time in the same sense. So when your opponent violates this, when they hold two beliefs that cannot simultaneously be true, you point it out. You've argued both that intentions are what matter morally and that we should judge actions by outcomes. These can't both be your principle. Either intentions matter, in which case outcomes are secondary, or outcomes matter, in which case intentions are secondary. Which is it? This is internal contradiction. You're not attacking their position from outside. You're showing that their position attacks itself from within. Direct contradiction is psychologically intolerable. The brain experiences cognitive dissonance when holding contradictory beliefs, and that dissonance creates pressure to resolve the contradiction. 10 minutes ago, you said expertise doesn't matter because everyone's opinion is valid. Now you're citing expert opinion to support your claim. You can't have it both ways. The mistake is claiming contradiction when the beliefs are merely intention. Some beliefs can seem contradictory on the surface, but actually be reconcilable with more nuance. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for genuine, direct logical contradiction. P and not P, both claimed as true. When you find that, you found something they cannot maintain. They have to resolve it. They have to choose which belief to keep and which to abandon. And in that moment of forced choice, you've taken control of the argument. Trick 41, the dilemma construction. There's a classical rhetorical move that feels like a trap closing. You present two options. Only two. and both lead exactly where you want them to go. Either you're claiming expertise matters, in which case the scientific consensus wins this argument, or expertise doesn't matter, in which case your expert opinion that you just cited is irrelevant. Which is it? This is dilemma construction. Both horns of the dilemma lead to your conclusion. They're forced to choose between two alternatives, and neither one helps them. If they accept option A, they lose. If they accept option B, they also lose. There's no good exit. The structure is elegant. You're not arguing against their position directly. You're showing that their position, when examined, contains an internal fork, and both paths lead to defeat. Either this policy works through the mechanism you described, in which case we should see specific measurable outcomes that we don't actually see, or it works through some other mechanism, in which case your explanation is wrong. The mistake people make is leaving a third option unexplored. If there's an obvious middle ground or alternative path they can take, the dilemma collapses. You have to be certain you've actually covered all the logical possibilities. But when you have truly constructed a dilemma, when both options genuinely exhaust the possibilities and both lead to conclusions they cannot accept, you've created a logical checkmate. They can't move forward without losing. Trick 42. The categorical precision. Language is slippery, and one of the ways people slip through arguments is by switching between categorical and probabilistic claims without acknowledging the shift. They'll say this always fails when they need a strong claim. Then, when you provide a counterexample, they'll say, well, it usually fails, as if they never made the categorical claim in the first place. You don't let them do that. Are you claiming this is always true, never true, or true in some percentage of cases? Be specific. This is categorical precision. You're forcing them to commit to the scope of their claim. Because categorical claims and probabilistic claims have completely different logical properties. Universal quantifiers require universal proof. If you claim something is always true, a single counterexample destroys your claim. But existential quantifiers, claims about some or many, require only a single instance to prove. You said always 3 minutes ago. You used that exact word. But now you're giving me counterexamples to your own rule. So which is it? Always or usually? The fragility of categorical claims makes this move powerful. Most people make categorical claims because they sound more convincing. This never works sounds stronger than this rarely works. But that strength becomes a vulnerability. Because never means not even once. And if you can show even a single instance where it worked, their claim collapses. The mistake is letting them slide between categorical and probabilistic without calling it out. You have to hold them to the precision of their original claim. You didn't say usually. You said always. And always has a specific meaning. Does your claim still stand, or do you want to revise it? Trick 43. The principle universalization. Your opponent has stated a principle, a rule they think should guide reasoning or action, and in the specific case they're applying it to, it seems to support their position. But principles don't get to be selectively applied. If it's truly a principle, if it's truly a rule about how we should think or act, then it must be universalizable. If everyone reasoned this way, what would happen? If we applied this principle to all cases, not just this one, what would the world look like? This is principle universalization. You're taking their stated principle and expanding it to its logical limit. You're arguing that personal experience is sufficient evidence for belief. Okay, if we accepted that principle universally, then all contradictory personal experiences would be equally valid. Your experience says X is true, someone else's experience says X is false, and both have equal epistemic status. Knowledge becomes impossible. The brain recognizes when a principle leads to chaos if universalized. When applying a rule consistently would destroy the very possibility of what the rule is supposed to enable. This is Kant's categorical imperative weaponized. A moral or logical principle must be something you could will to be universal law. If universalizing it leads to contradiction or absurdity, it's not a valid principle. The mistake is universalizing in a way that changes the principle. You have to take their exact principle, not a distorted version of it, and show what happens when it's applied universally. You can't say this principle applies here, but not there. Either it's a principle, in which case it applies everywhere, or it's not a principle. It's just a preference you're dressing up as reasoning. Trick 44. The logical priority. Not all claims are equal. Some claims are logically prior to others. They have to be established first before the dependent claims can even be meaningfully discussed. And your opponent is trying to skip the prior claim and argue about the dependent one. Before we can discuss whether this policy is good, we need to establish whether the mechanism you're describing even exists. You're assuming the mechanism and arguing about its benefits. First, prove the mechanism exists. This is logical priority. You're identifying the correct order of reasoning and insisting it be followed. Some claims must be proven before others can even be evaluated. If I claim that unicorns are endangered, you need to first establish that unicorns exist before we can meaningfully debate their conservation status. Your opponent wants to argue about whether X is beneficial, but X's existence is still in question. So the benefit question is premature. You're putting the cart before the horse. We can't evaluate outcomes until we establish that the thing producing those outcomes is real. The mistake is letting them reverse the logical order. Because if they can get you arguing about the dependent claim, they've smuggled in acceptance of the prior claim without ever proving it. Let's back up. You're assuming A and building arguments on that assumption. But A itself needs justification. Provide that first, then we can discuss what follows from it. Correct logical ordering makes hidden dependencies visible. It forces the argument to proceed in the sequence that logic demands, not the sequence that's rhetorically convenient. Trick 45. The evidential asymmetry. Your opponent has accepted one claim with minimal evidence, but they're rejecting another claim despite substantial evidence. And you're going to make that asymmetry visible. You accepted claim X based on a single anecdote and a blog post. But you're rejecting claim Y despite 3 meta-analyses and 15 years of research. Explain the different standards. This is evidential asymmetry. You're showing that they're applying different standards of evidence to claims they like versus claims they dislike. And that's motivated reasoning. That's bias. That's not rational belief formation. That's belief defense. You're demanding randomized controlled trials for this policy. But that policy, which you supported, was implemented based on theoretical arguments alone. Why does one require the highest possible standard of evidence, while the other required none? Rational belief requires consistent evidentiary standards. You don't get to demand proof for claims you're skeptical of while accepting claims you favor on faith. The mistake is comparing claims that genuinely deserve different standards. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims they can fly, you should demand stronger proof than if they claim they can run. But when the claims are comparable, when they're the same type of claim, requiring the same type of evidence, different standards reveal bias. Apply one standard. Either both claims need strong evidence, or neither does. But you don't get to demand rigor for positions you oppose while accepting weak evidence for positions you support. Double standards signal motivated reasoning, and once exposed, they undermine credibility across the board. Trick 46. The alliance signal. Humans are tribal. We extend trust, cooperation, and good faith more readily to people we perceive as part of our group. This isn't a bug. It's a feature. It's how our brains are wired by millions of years of evolution. So you signal alliance. Look, we both care about fairness here. We both want a system that actually works for people. We're just disagreeing about the means, not the ends. This is the alliance signal. You're subtly indicating shared group membership, shared values, shared identity. And something changes. In-group identification triggers oxytocin release. Oxytocin reduces defensive aggression. It promotes trust and cooperation. You're not enemies on opposite sides. You're members of the same tribe who happen to see the path forward differently. We're both trying to solve the same problem. We both recognize the harm that's being done. The question is just which approach actually addresses it. The mistake is being too obvious about it. If it feels like pandering, if it feels like you're artificially claiming common ground you don't actually share, it backfires. It has to be genuine, or at least plausible. You have to find real common ground, real shared values, and make those salient. We both value evidence-based policy. We both want to minimize suffering. So let's examine the evidence together and see where it actually leads. In-group bias is powerful. When someone is perceived as one of us, their arguments receive more charitable interpretation. Their intentions are assumed to be good. Their mistakes are forgiven more readily. You're not manipulating someone into a false sense of alliance. You're making real points of commonality salient so that tribal defenses can lower and actual communication can happen. Trick 47. The status preemption. Status matters in arguments. It shouldn't, perhaps, but it does. Higher status individuals are granted more credibility, more benefit of the doubt, more persuasive power. So you establish your status before it can be challenged. In my 15 years working in this field, the pattern I've consistently noticed is, what just happened? You casually referenced relevant expertise. You established credentials. You claimed status. And you did it early, before anyone could question whether you have standing to make the claims you're about to make. This is status preemption. First claimed status is harder to dispute than status claimed in response to a challenge. If they challenge your expertise after you've already established it, they look like they're the ones being defensive. But if you claim expertise in response to their challenge, it looks like you're scrambling to justify yourself. The timing matters. Having published 3 books on this exact topic, I can tell you the academic consensus is, now if they want to challenge your expertise, they have to actively dispute your claimed credentials. They have to be the aggressor. And aggression against claimed status has social costs. The mistake is seeming like you're bragging. It can't feel like you're name-dropping or credential flaunting. It has to be natural, relevant, just part of how you're explaining your perspective. When I was working on these issues at institution, we ran into this exact problem, and what we found was, social hierarchy creates deference. People naturally defer to perceived expertise. And by establishing your expertise early and casually, you're activating that deference before the argument even begins. Trick 48. The audience positioning. If there's an audience, observers, bystanders, people listening to this argument, then the argument isn't really about convincing your opponent. It's about winning the audience. Because your opponent is invested. They're dug in. They have ego attached to their position. They're unlikely to concede publicly regardless of how strong your arguments are. But the audience? The audience is persuadable. So you don't speak to your opponent. You speak past them, to the people watching. You make arguments that resonate with the audience's values. You frame points in terms the audience cares about. You demonstrate reasonableness, patience, and evidence-based thinking because those are the qualities the audience rewards. This is audience positioning. You're playing for the spectators, not the opponent. I think most people watching this would agree that when the evidence is this clear, we have an obligation to follow it, even if it's uncomfortable. You just appealed directly to the audience. You made them feel included. You positioned them as reasonable people who value evidence. And you implicitly contrasted that with your opponent's position. The mistake is ignoring your actual opponent. You can't make it obvious that you're not engaging with them. You have to appear to be arguing with them while actually performing for the audience. This is evolutionary. Reputation management matters more than winning any single interaction. The audience will remember who seemed reasonable, who seemed fair, who seemed to have the better arguments. And their judgment affects your status in the broader group. Arguments in public aren't really arguments. They're performances. And the audience determines who wins. Trick 49. The authority triangulation. You could make the claim yourself. But your claim, standing alone, is just one person's opinion. It carries only as much weight as your personal credibility. Or you could triangulate. You could cite authority, expertise, consensus. You could transfer credibility from established sources to your position. The leading researchers in this field, across political divides, representing different methodological approaches, agree that the evidence overwhelmingly supports this conclusion. This is authority triangulation. You're not asking people to trust you. You're asking them to trust the accumulated expertise of recognized authorities. And humans are wired for this. When uncertain, we defer to perceived experts. It's cognitive offloading. The brain saves energy by not having to evaluate everything from first principles. Instead, it checks, what do the experts think? According to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Medical Association, and the World Health Organization, you've just borrowed credibility from 3 major institutions. Your claim is no longer just your opinion. It's aligned with institutional consensus. The mistake is citing authorities your opponent has reason to distrust. If you cite sources they view as biased or compromised, the authority transfer fails. You have to choose authorities they either respect or would look unreasonable rejecting. Even researchers who oppose this policy on philosophical grounds acknowledge that the empirical evidence shows. Now you're citing authorities who should be biased against your position but accept it anyway. That's even more powerful than citing friendly authorities. Social proof works. Authority works. Not because it's logically valid. Argument from authority is technically a fallacy, but because it's psychologically effective. Trick 50. The dismissive brevity. Your opponent just gave a 5-minute speech. They built an elaborate argument with multiple premises, examples, and emotional appeals. They said a lot, and you respond with 1 sentence. That assumes X, which isn't true. Next point. This is dismissive brevity. You're responding to their lengthy argument with brief, confident dismissal. And the contrast does something powerful. Length can signal insecurity. Over-explanation can signal that you're trying to compensate for weak arguments with volume. But brevity, calm, confident brevity, signals that you're so certain of your position that you don't need to elaborate. You don't need to explain at length because the flaw in their argument is obvious to you. This is status communication. High-status actors can afford brevity. They can make pronouncements. Low-status actors over-explain because they're trying to justify their right to speak. That's been debunked. 3 words. And if you say it with enough confidence, if your status is high enough, those 3 words can carry more weight than their entire argument. The mistake is being dismissive when you can't back it up. If they press you, if they say, how has it been debunked? And you can't provide a substantive answer, your dismissive brevity becomes exposed weakness rather than confident strength. But when you can back it up, when you genuinely do have the stronger position and can afford to be brief, dismissive brevity makes their elaborate arguments seem desperate by contrast. Brevity signals confidence, and confidence, even when unjustified, is persuasive. Conclusion. And there you have it, 50 psychological techniques that transform how arguments unfold. But here's the thing. Knowing these tactics doesn't just make you better at winning debates. It makes you better at recognizing when they're being used on you. Because the most dangerous arguments aren't the ones where someone tries to beat you with facts. They're the ones where someone reshapes reality so subtly that you don't even notice you've been outmaneuvered. Use these techniques wisely. Use them ethically. Remember that the goal of any meaningful argument shouldn't be domination. It should be truth, understanding, or at least mutual respect. But when you need to defend yourself, when you need to cut through manipulation, when you need to make your case heard, now you have the tools. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology of human behavior. Drop a comment telling me which technique surprised you most, or which one you've seen used against you in the wild. And remember, the most powerful move in any argument isn't the one that destroys your opponent. It's the one that makes destruction unnecessary. Until next time, stay sharp.